Hi, welcome to Module 3.1, Assembling the Tender Package. In this module, our course transitions from being about making important decisions that reflect your project's values and goals to making sure we fill out checklists correctly, focusing on technical details and ensuring that our legal obligations within the tender package are met. As always, we'd like to thank Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation for their support of this project through community-led designs for specialized housing in the North. And acknowledge the partnership that makes this certificate possible between Together Design Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University, Nishnawbe Aski Nation, the Faculty of Community Services at Toronto Metropolitan University, and WASA Distance Education Center. As I've said, we're transitioning in this module from a part of tendering and procurement that was really about understanding the project that you want to undertake and selecting the kind of methodologies and strategies that support that project into project execution and moving towards the creation of a tender package using template documents that are legally sound. In this module in particular, we're going to look at three guiding questions. What are the components of a tender package? Why is it important to remain consistent with template documents? And that's something we may have alluded to already. And how does the contract type influence the tender package that you're putting together? But let's start with a quick review. Since we've been through a number of terms already in this course, let's head back to where we are today at the tender package with what is tendering? And that's the process through which you're going to secure or procure contractors in order to make your built project a reality. And what is the tender package or bid package, as you'll hear me refer to it sometimes in both this module and some upcoming ones? It's the document or set of documents that gives technical instructions to potential bidders that they should follow in order to be one of the bidders for your project. It has information about how bids will be assessed, and importantly, it's clear and transparent to ensure that all bids can be treated equally, returning to the two kind of key values throughout this course of transparency and fairness. The tender package and what it outlines to potential bidders are what guarantees those two values hold true in your tendering process. Now, why do you benefit from a well-prepared tender package? And there's kind of two reasons here that I want to focus on. The first, in providing the kind of maximum amount of clear information to potential bidders, will both attract more bids and better bids. So by demonstrating that you've thought through many of the elements of your project, that you've done the due diligence, that you have clear construction drawings, for example, if you're going with a design bid build, just by showing that your project has been well thought through and that you've addressed a number of potential concerns, what you do is reduce the risk of potential bidders and you create certainty for them in their bid. And that can bring you more bids and lower, better value bids. The second thing that a well-prepared tender package gets you is a reduction in legal liability. The tendering process, as we've pointed to throughout this course, is a highly legalized process. And if your documents aren't well put together and if there are errors or omissions, you do open yourself up to legal liability. Throughout this course, we are relying on standardized documents, and you'll see primarily examples of CCDC documents. Those are the industry standard, the Canadian Construction Documents Committee. By using industry standard documents, you're ensuring both that you put forward high quality tender packages, as well as ensuring that potential bidders are familiar with what they're looking at. Again, that reduces risk for potential bidders. It brings more people to the table. you can create custom tender documents. It's not a requirement to use the CC documents or even some of the Indigenous Services Canada documents that we may look at here. But whenever you're using custom documents, you are adding risk, legal risk for sure, as well as challenge for potential bidders in navigating your new and different forms. So what we would suggest and what we're going to work through here is CC/DC documents. Now, what you see at the bottom of your screen here is a list of things that you should have ready where available. And again, this depends on the type of contract that you're doing, the choices that you made throughout section 2 of this course will impact what's required here. And we'll get into this more as we go. What should go in a tender package? Now, as I said in the first slide of this module, this course does take a real transition here from being about you reflecting on the type of project you want to run, and instead now moving towards filling out checklists and making sure you've got all of your documents in order. And so we show a list on screen here as well as on the next slide of typical tender package documents. And I'm not going to go over each of these in detail because it really is a checklist. And so as you reach this stage in the project, it's just something for you to work with and to work down this list to make sure you've got everything together. And while I say it's a checklist, actually it's many checklists. And there are different organizations who have put together different packages and checklists for you to work with. And we list a number of them on screen here, ranging from CMHC to FIMBOA, the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. But what I would say is that you don't so much have to worry about, oh, am I working with the right one? Many of these are quite similar. So find the one that works best in your workflow, whose language speaks to you the most. It's not really going to make a huge difference. You may have in your organization one that people work with already, or at your tribal council, or from your funders, and just go with what works. While they may be organized differently, look different, they all do get you to basically the same place. What we're showing on screen here is just in case you didn't, as you were taking this course, stop and click through all those links to test whether I was telling the truth about how those different sources really do amount to the same. We have on screen now a comparison between an Indigenous Services Canada checklist and a CC/DC checklist, just so that you can see that effectively they get you to the same place, even if the names on things are a little bit different. So let's talk about some of the more important components of that and really just giving examples of what these things look like so that you can be more familiar when you're going through this checklist on your own in the future. The first is instruction to bidders. Now this is particularly important because the whole point of a tendering process is that you receive bids and you receive high quality bids. The only way that's going to be possible is if your instructions to bidders are clear and you don't turn this into a kind of game where bidders are trying to figure out what to do. And ultimately, when you have unclear instructions to bidders, what can happen is that you end up having to exclude or remove a number of bids because they don't meet criteria, and they may not be meeting it just because it was unclear to begin with. The second thing I want to talk about, and we'll spend a little bit more time here because there's something a little bit more finicky about this, and this is clauses. Clauses are noted in the instructions and incorporated also throughout the tender package where appropriate. And clauses give you the right to make slight variations from the template document. So these are like special case scenarios, basically. And there are a few clauses that are more common and you know, kind of verge on being template, really. And then there are others that you may want to add because of really special cases or something unique about your project. That said, I would offer caution here. I will offer this caution throughout the course, and it's the idea that while each project may feel really unique and special to you because it's really important to your community, remember that the more you do that's outside of standard practice or that's outside of these templates, the more risk you create. And so try to understand why you're coming up with so many special cases and be cautious of that. Think through whether it's really required, or in creating all these special cases, whether you're creating additional legal liability. That said, one of the first clause that we will talk about actually responds to what we saw directly on the previous slide, which was about instructions to bidders. A clause that you may add is the owner's right to waive or accept minor or inconsequential irregularities in a bidder's package. Now, let's give a very simple example of that. Most or some tender packages require that every page of the package be signed and dated in the bottom corner. You may choose as a clause to waive these minor or inconsequential irregularities, meaning that if one page is signed but not dated, you don't have to throw out the whole bid. So it can be a way of making sure that you don't have to exclude otherwise high quality bids because of something like an administrative error. Other clauses shown on screen here can include like what you're going to do if only a single bid is received, or alternative clauses, and that's important. It talks about where alternative prices or materials will be accepted. So you, as the owner of the project, for example, in a design bid build, may have included or should have included a full drawing package and specification in your tender package. But you may list either for the entirety of the package, or more commonly and certainly better practice is to include specific components of your build where you will accept alternatives. And that's where a bidder might identify another product or similar product but different from what's listed as what they suggest, and that may be able to bring you in a lower cost without substantively changing your build. So clauses can be used to create certain permissions for bidders, but you do see the red icon on screen, so be cautious when you're using clauses. Make sure you're not taking on additional risk or legal liability with the clauses that you're adding. Available project information, and this is something we should do some careful thinking about. As we talked about earlier with putting together a clear and transparent tender package, there are two reasons why you want to share all potential information in your tender package. And on screen here, we have a list of what some types of that information can be. Things like geotechnical data, surveys, environmental assessments, things about the site and the project that might be relevant to the bidder. The first reason to do that, and that's kind of regardless of the age of that information or what you think about that information, you should include it because it does reduce risk for the potential bidder, and again, demonstrates the due diligence that you've done. It allows them to better assess and reflect on what this project's going to entail, probably getting you a lower cost or better value bid. But also, this is about legal liability, as we've mentioned throughout. Failure to disclose information can leave you legally liable if bidders discover that later because you have provided inaccurate information. So it's both about creating better and lower cost bids and potentially increasing your pool of bidders by showing you've done your due diligence, and also reducing your legal liability. So make sure you share what you know about the project. Tender or bid form, here again, we're just showing an example of fairly standard forms. And so what you see here is what is traditionally on a tender or bid form. And these things we're going to talk about advertising your bid coming up in a future in the next module, actually, and how that's often moved to kind of online systems now. And you see here that a lot of this has been automated. These are standard forms, and just make sure they're included. On screen now, you see an example, a CCDC stipulated price bid form. And why we show this on screen here, and you can see all of the arrows pointing to these kind of fillable components of the form, is to show how formulaic and how template the actual tender package becomes once you've gone through all the work from the chart that we showed throughout section 2, where you were choosing the contract type and your construction method and your procurement strategy. Once you do that, you are kind of just given the correct CCDC template, and it's easy for everyone to complete. You see the second or another page of that template here. Now, just to show you another CCDC form. So again, following through that causal link chart from section 2 of this course, in this case, we're looking at a CCDC unit price bid form. So you see a different contract type leading to a different bid form. That makes sense from what we learned in the previous section. And going through that chart just ensures that you're using the correct form when we get to preparing the tender documents. Now, there are a few other forms that may be required to collect information specified in the tender package. So these are additional things that a potential bidder would have to submit. You see the note here, and we offer this note in a number of places. It will come up again in the next module, where anytime you're requesting additional information, you're doing so in a way that you need to balance two competing interests. The first is that while you, as the owner, want to learn the maximum possible information and reduce risk in the maximum possible way for the bids that you'll be evaluating, which may increase your likelihood of wanting more additional forms, you have to balance that with the idea that for each additional form you request, you're creating more administrative burden for a potential bidder, and you don't want to dissuade the best possible bidders or the people who could create the best project for you just because you've created so much administrative burden. That said, there are some common forms that can be requested, and they include bid security, alternative prices. We've talked about that already, when those would be relevant. Itemized prices, unit prices. Again, those are going to depend on the type of contract and bid form that you're using for a given project. Let's take just 1 second to talk about bid security and make sure that it's understood. Bid security is often required as a way of reducing risk for you, the project owner, and it's submitted by the bidder along with their application. And what it ensures is that if a bidder is selected, that it guarantees they will enter into the contract with you, the owner. If the bidder fails to enter into the contract, then you, the owner, would keep their security deposit, both as a way of kind of compensating the owner for the administrative burden they incurred in a failed tendering process, as well as the administrative burden they'll incur for having to rerun a tendering process, and just to create some kind of financial penalty to the bidder for not entering into the contract. Typically, bid security that should be required is 10% of the anticipated total project cost. For smaller projects, that will be obviously a smaller amount of money. So, for example, as what you see on screen, a $250,000 project would require a $25,000 bid security. Now, at that comparatively or relatively low rate, you might be able to take bid security as something like a certified check or a bank draft. It would make sense that a contractor of a certain scale undertaking work like this would have access to that. However, at a larger scale project, at $5 million, for example, 10% is $500,000. That's a significant amount of money. And instead, what you would move to in that case is a bid bond. And a bid bond introduces a kind of third party, an insurance company, where the potential bidder would approach a bid surety agency, and those agencies in Canada are all licensed. And they would pre-qualify with that surety company, and that company would review all of their kind of financials, their expertise, and would evaluate the bid bond or the bid security that they would be comfortable issuing. And then your bid security would come from this third party. So that gives you the same risk reduction that any other bid security would, where there is a financial penalty for failing to enter into the contract. But it also gives you a second level of risk reduction because the potential bidder has had to go through a substantial pre-qualification process through, as I mentioned, a licensed corporation in Canada who won't want to work with these kind of fly-by-night companies. And so getting a bid bond, while it does increase the burden on a potential bidder and probably shouldn't be used in small-scale projects, it does have this kind of dual risk reduction function in larger projects. We talked a little bit about alternatives already, but I do just want to touch on it one more time because I would say, in my experience, in particular in the North, alternatives can be a way to generate better, lower cost or faster timelines through really experienced contractors who will understand and potentially have unique knowledge of northern supply chains, and that can incorporate kind of year over year changes in those supply chains. So you may have real incentive to accept alternatives from potential bidders on really specific items from within your package. But the caution I want to leave you here, and this is a caution I think we'll address again later in the course actually, is to make sure that when you're evaluating bids that include alternatives, that within your team you have the technical capacity to evaluate whether the alternatives that are being proposed are truly equivalent alternatives. And so alternatives can be a useful way for you as the project owner to reduce cost, to speed up your project, and also to reduce risk, relying on the specialized knowledge of contractors working within your area. However, you should be cautious of what alternatives are being suggested, and make sure to only go forward with those kinds of alternatives if you have the technical capacity to review them. We have on screen here some information about other bid form supplements, and I'm not going to cover these in detail because as we go through more and more of these, they do become about more niche and less common situations. But I do want to provide this information for you here about itemized price and unit prices in case they are scenarios that you run into, and to have this information as a resource. And we will talk at other points in this course about the glossary that's provided to you through this course that has many more key terms, as you see the terms highlighted in red here. And when you're working through your own tendering process, you can always refer back to that glossary. It's only a few pages long to get definitions for these key terms, and it will also point you to the module where you could learn more if you need to. Again, a last key term here, a list of subcontractors, and these are all forms that, as I've said, will allow you to gain more information if it's relevant to the type of bid form and contract that you will be working with. Articles of Agreement are the contract form, and that's included in the tender package because From this tender package, the winning bid will flow directly through into a contract. And we'll talk about that in a few modules' time when we get to signing the contract. But we include it here as a way of demonstrating to you that the tender package really represents this big transition in the project where the project goes from being developed in your office and it goes out into the world in this tender package with all of the information that will be required going forward. From this point on, there should not be significant surprises or changes in your project. Your tender package has all the information required to govern you right through to contract signing. We've talked already about how in a design, bid, build tender package situation, your tender package should have things like technical specifications, drawings, schedules, and schedules in this case refers to a kind of chart or table that has a list of all the windows or doors or specialty products that will be included. And having all of these construction documents in good order in an easy to read fashion is really what we're talking about when we were talking earlier in this module about having clear tender documents. The more uncertainty there is or trouble there is for a potential bidder in reading any of your technical documents, the more risk they incur and the challenges they'll have putting a bid together. And so you may not be getting the lowest or best value bid that you could get. Terms of payment is another fairly standard portion of the tender package, and we'll address this again in some more detail in a later module where we talk about monitoring payments, holdbacks, and what to do in the case of non-conforming work. But all of that should already be outlined to the potential bidder here within the terms of payment. This is another example of how the totality of the project's working conditions are outlined in the tender package. General requirements, conditions, again, this is fairly standard, and we're going to show on the next page what this looks like. But what I want to stress around general conditions is that while the document that we'll show about general conditions looks daunting, this is where the kind of template documents provide their real value, is that your construction project has to follow many of the norms that other construction projects have in the past. And so you don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Instead, you want to demonstrate to the contractor the kind of norms that you will be following. So a list of the general conditions from CCDC, again, just to show that you are building on an existing body of work here, and you shouldn't need to be creating a whole host of custom documents. A similar list from Indigenous Services from a few years earlier. Other conditions, this is where we may get to some more specific things and requirements that you may have from a bidder. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of these also as we get into the module about signing contracts and other supplemental forms that contractors will be required to submit, including things like insurance documents and workers' compensation documents, things like that. Now, a kind of final thing I want to touch on here, and we'll talk about this in the next module once again to reiterate this importance, but as your tender package goes out into the world, there can be the need for certain modifications or for certain clarification. And even between all of the documents that we've talked about here today, ranging from the contract to special conditions or to technical drawings, it's possible that there could be minor discrepancies between those documents. Now, these aren't going to be huge things where, like, in one we're talking about building a 4-bedroom house and in the other one a 2-bedroom house, but small, usually kind of administrative or clerical discrepancies. What's important for you to note is that there is a legal hierarchy in those documents where if there's a discrepancy, which one should be seen as the correct answer. And so we have that hierarchy on screen here for you now. Now, obviously, we hope that in all of your projects, there's never any discrepancies. You filled out all the forms perfectly, no clerical errors, then you don't have to worry about this. But if there is an error, then this is how you would decide which one to move forward with. Supplementary conditions, and this is the last concept we'll touch on here today. And I just want to reiterate again that supplementary conditions should be used sparingly. You are building on the work of others in the industry who have undertaken construction projects for years and generations that have led to the creation of the CCDC templates. So if you for some reason see that you need a custom clause added or a change made to those templates, you would do it through either supplementary conditions or amendments, depending on which document you're changing. But be sure whenever you're doing so that you work with your own legal counsel, because as we've said, anytime you go off the template, you are incurring some legal risk. Well, in this module, we've covered a lot of ground, but much of it, the hard work is done by existing templates that you can access. And so what you're really doing is applying the decisions that you made in section 2 into a template and being able to put your project forward in the clearest possible way to potential bidders. That said, if you're ever interested in more information, the references used throughout this module can be found on screen now. Thank you.